For this assignment, I decided to reanalyze my inquiry essay that focused on the Great Schism from 1054. My initial audience that I focused on was religious scholars or theologians, and the primary purpose was to try and analyze the schism from a historical and theological standpoint and understand the complex causes that led to the schism. And I tried to focus on the doctrinal, cultural, and political factors that helped lead to the schism, and I tried to provide a neutral scholarly approach to it. But in this edition, I decided to shift my attention to modern day church leaders like priests, pastors, or just anyone who considers themselves to be a leader towards faith-based individuals. And my purpose also changed because I decided to focus, instead of being purely academic, on how lessons from the Great Schism can help modern church leaders prevent division within their own congregation. And I wanted to help make the history relevant and accessible to people who aren't necessarily the most familiar with complicated church history. And I chose the TED Talk as my format because I feel like it helps me connect directly with this audience using storytelling, examples, and pauses for reflection. I feel like pastors and religious leaders typically can respond well to narrative and practical guidance, and this medium helped me be able to compare historical research with my own personal insight. And speaking aloud about this helped give me the chance to emphasize the relationship, human behavior, and emotional aspects of church division, rather than just some theological focus in an academic essay. And when I adapted it, I decided to make several key revisions to my work. First off, I decided to shift my tone from being more formal to conversational and reflective. And instead of writing to a professor who expects deep historical analysis, I decided to focus more on church leaders who think in terms of people, relationships, and congregational life. I used a lot of first-person language, rhetorical questions, and pauses for reflection multiple times throughout what I said in my analysis essay was think about that for a moment, or I'd like you to pause and reflect on this to help invite the audience to consider their own thoughts about it and their own experiences or challenges. And then second, I decided to add storytelling in vivid historical examples. For instance, I decided to highlight the excommunication over unleavened bread and the sacking of Constantinople. I feel like these stories help make a boring history topic seem more engaging in spoken form, and I feel like they help illustrate how minor disputes that are amplified by pride and cultural misunderstandings lead to major fractures. And I feel like storytelling just in general makes history more memorable and digestible. And then third, I decided to draw clear connections between the past and the present. After COVID, a lot of congregations split over politics, church power, and the healthcare system. And I feel like these modern divisions are a really good example of the fault lines from the 11th century. And by emphasizing on these parallels, I feel like I help make the schism more personable and real to people today. And then fourth, I decided to focus on human factors over abstract theological disputes. In my original essay, I decided to analyze theology, politics, and culture academically, while in my TED Talk, I decided to emphasize how pride, specifically pride, mistrust, and miscommunication can intensify conflicts. And what my point was to show modern leaders that theological disagreement is rarely the cause for split or being the real enemy. What I think the real enemy is broken relationships, unchecked pride, and cultural misunderstandings are. And I feel like through this process, I learned several things about working in a spoken multi-module genre. Timing and pacing are crucial. I realized that what sounds like it doesn't take a lot of time to communicate in an essay does take a lot of time to bring about in a video format. And I know that my listeners are religious leaders, which helped shift the content and the tone that I was able to focus on. I was able to shift it to practical lessons and the relationship dynamic rather than just the historical analysis side. And I feel like the storytelling was powerful. It humanized historical figures and connected them to modern experiences. that made the abstract events seem more meaningful and urgent. But if I were to do this project again, I would probably incorporate some visual aids to help complement the talk, maybe some maps of the East and the West, some timelines, or maybe even some images of the Western Church sacking Constantinople. Maybe that could make the historical divisions more tangible. I'd also like to rehearse this more to help fine-tune everything that I'm saying, but it's hard when there's a lot of information that's historical that I need to communicate. And I feel like finally this adaptation helped change my perspective on the Great Schism as a whole. When I first viewed it, I thought that it was something that I would just analyze objectively, but now I see it as a mirror for modern leadership. And I feel like it's a case study in how pride, miscommunication, cultural identity, and political influence can fracture communities. And it's no longer just history, it's a guide that we can go off of today. But by reflecting on the schism, I feel like religious leaders can learn to preserve unity in their own communities, respond to conflict with humility, and recognize the human, cultural, and political forces that shape disagreements. Just be better representations of Christ as a whole. And to conclude, adapting my essay into a TED Talk allowed me to rethink how research speaks to practice. I moved from analysis to engagement, from description to reflection, and from historical observation to practical guidance. And by trying to speak directly to religious leaders, I feel like I created a project that wasn't only informative, but also inspires reflection and action. And to me personally, this experience reminded me that history is not just about the past, it's about the present, and it's about guiding the present and shaping the future. Thank you so much.